Welcome to this week's Wednesday seminar, the first seminar of March, as we cautiously approach spring. So yesterday was a bit of a reversal in that trend. Anyway, I'm Taylor Fable, Director of the MIT Security Studies Program. We're really delighted today to welcome Paul DeLuca, who's the Director of the Navy and Marine Forces Program and a Senior Engineer at RAND. He's going to talk on the Navy we need, maritime dominance in a world of interlocking supply chains. The Navy and Marine Forces Program RAND is part of the National Security Research Division, for those of you who are familiar with RAND. He works on technology issues for the U.S. Navy, the Coast Guard, SOCOM, the Air Force, as well as the Australian DoD. His recent research includes a series of analyses of alternatives for the special operations community and the U.S. Coast Guard. Other study topics include an analysis of methods to sustain nuclear submarine design skills in the United States, implementing open architecture systems within the Aegis combat system, and exploring options for improved air-naval cooperation. Paul holds a PhD in materials science and engineering from Northwestern University. And although it's not on his bio, he did mention to me he also spent some time in the semiconductor industry. So he's well-versed both in ships and one of the very important things that are in our supply chains today. Anyway, Paul, welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Great to have you.
Well, so thanks for the opportunity to come up and visit. I actually lived down in Providence for 6 years in the semiconductor industry and worked in Taunton. So the weather yesterday was a welcome home to me. So I did enjoy my time there. I'm just going to give you a little perspective on where this research that I'm going to present to you, some of it's sort of been internally funded, some of it comes out of work we do for the Navy. But RAND, our research is sort of bespoke contractor research, if you will. We don't operate out of a corpus of funding for which we do research. We pretty much have sponsors in the Navy or the Air Force or the DoD, and they have a question, and then we answer the question. And to get that funding, we always have to convince them that it's okay to give us a lot of money to answer a question for which we're going to give you an answer that we like and you don't like. But that's sort of what we do, right? So we're not a think tank in any traditional sense. We do contract research, if you will, to answer questions for someone that's paying us to answer that question, and that's where this work comes out of. So this is an amalgamation of a bunch of projects, and before I get into it, I just would like to say that there's two big things here. There's this question of whether the Navy, what should the Navy look like? What do we need the Navy to do as a country? And I think as part of that is, if you want to build a Navy, for example, you have to buy a bunch of stuff. So we have big supply chain issues. We have industrial-based challenges. We have financial challenges to build the Navy. Part of the demand signal for a Navy is it's a very interconnected economy. And we're living that dream today with, are the Straits of Hormuz going to stay open? Are they not going to stay open? So this interconnectedness, this supply chain issue is hugely important for the supply signal of the Navy. Can I build the Navy I want? And the demand signal, why do I need a Navy? So we'll harp on a couple of those today. I don't know why I start with this. It just seems like we should start with, why is there a Navy? It's actually a Title X thing. Here's what the Navy is, right? So we have to start there because they actually pretend to go for this. And, you know, this is not any official position, but I personally think if you go back to Secretary of the War, in the old days, the Secretary of the War and the Secretary of the Navy were two different people, and the Secretary of the Navy didn't report to the Secretary of War. So I think that might be as a Naval Academy grad, I think that would be pretty cool to go back that way. But I'll put that aside. The Navy is really there. The Navy, the Department of the Navy exists to train, man, and equip forces that the country can use. All right, it doesn't make policy. It doesn't say where we're going to use those ships. They're used by someone else, the combatant commanders under political control. But historically, what has that really meant? What we designed the Navy for and what it actually does are probably two very distinct things. So historically and today, it represents U.S. interests abroad. If you go into the port of Singapore right now, there's probably 1 or 2 Navy ships there. There's a detachment of supply. There's a command in Singapore. If you go into a lot of ports in Asia, there will be Navy ships doing port calls. They will be doing exercises all the time. They're out and about. So we represent U.S. interests aboard. We provide presence in an area of interest. So immediately we're going to signal into an area of interest, we're going to flow naval forces. It's one of the first things that the White House or policymakers can use to express U.S. interests. Send the carriers, send frigates, tell them we're sending a submarine, even though they don't know if we did or didn't. And it also provides you an option in the event of that crisis, right? It provides a challenge to the opposition. It makes their planning more difficult. What's the Navy doing? So that is what we do day to day. We design a Navy to do the last thing, win the big war, right? That is the dominant driver for our force structure. What are we going to have in the Navy? And the dominant big war right now is if we were to get into a conflict with China. So we design the Navy to win the big war at sea, and then we ask it to do a bunch of other stuff. So if you're ever in the, that dichotomy exists every day in the Navy and how we use it. I think we just look at the highlights just recently to show this. I mean, I literally had to change the names since I said I'd do the talk, right? So Epic Fury, we have 2 carrier battle groups in the Middle East doing a lot of strike operations. They're doing Tomahawk missile strikes out of the surface ships, and they're doing extensive missile defense operations, both of their own forces and then projecting missile defense over the ground, over populations. Operation Joint Resolve, among other things, when they took out Nicolas Maduro, they landed him on an Iwo Jima, an LHA, a Marine Corps ship, or a U.S. Navy ship for the Marine Corps. At the same time, we're doing maritime interdiction and blockade. Originally, we've been doing a lot of it in Venezuela. We're going to be doing more of it in the Middle East now. In fact, this morning, the president said we're going to start escorting ships in and out of the Straits of Hormuz. Very difficult operation. We do right now, it historically has been more of a Coast Guard mission, but you're seeing demand signal for the Navy into counter-drug and migrant operations in the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean. In the old days, if you went down to the Caribbean, the only thing you got were a P3 or a P8 planes with a bunch of reservists that were putting in their time to help out the Coast Guard. Now it's a demand signal. All of a sudden, that staff down there is running actual operations. We do strategic deterrence every day. We have a big base in Kings Bay and a big base in Washington State, and we're putting out, there's some obligation of 8, 10 ballistic missile submarines available every day. All right, so that happens every day. And then finally, back to the big war, what we'd really like to be is not win the big war, but deter the big war. So we're doing things to do deterrence in the Western Pacific. So this is just happening right now. So we looked at, not right now, because when we finished this, right now it hadn't happened, but it all fits the theme. We looked at, hey, what is the current or planned naval forces and how does that fit the national need? Right away, I would say, one of our conclusions is the Navy's force structure is misaligned between that historic use and current strategy. Again, this goes back to warfighting is key. We build ships. If you want to tell the Congress to write a really big check to build sophisticated ships, they say, how's it going to win the war? So we have a predilection towards warfighting as the demanding design criteria. Acquisition practices, therefore, the same thing. And we hear a lot of, and we'll get into this as much as you'd like, one of the challenges is if you build, the Ford-class aircraft carrier was $13 to $15 billion in the first copy. Not a bad business to get into, but the question is, why? So that ship is going to take us 10 years to design and build, and then it's going to be in operation for 50 years. And the last Ford class is going to be built somewhere 30 to 40 years after the first Ford class. So that's a 100-year ship. How long should you take to get it right? Right? If you were, the due diligence is you better make sure you're doing the right thing because it's an enormous investment of our treasury. So these things are hard. So let's go into a little bit more of, but what I really like to get down to highlight here is the warfighting part of it doesn't always capture the idea that you'd like to have lots of the Navy, right? What I'd like to do is be able to put the Navy lots of places, lots of times. And if you have a really high-end warfight that's putting requirements on my ships, they are going to get more and more expensive. And I have a fixed bill. The defense budget's about 3% of the GDP, and the Navy gets about 1% of that, or gets about 1/3 of that. So the Navy's constrained to about 1% of the GDP. So you have a fixed amount of money coming in the system. So I think the Navy has historically, because of this challenge, has underinvested into this presence and crisis response, that demand signal. Even though those are the first thing that happens, you hear that there's this dichotomy in the literature. Where's the carrier? President says, where's the carrier? We have 2 carriers there now. 90% of people write that says, in the next fight with China, all the carriers are going to go to the bottom of the ocean. Don't build another carrier. So the Navy has to reconcile those 2 viewpoints. Where's the carrier? And they're all going to get sunk. If you look at China, the PRC is investing heavily in what they call a maritime militia, the Coast Guard, their fisheries. You look at some of these ships, there's no difference between a Chinese Coast Guard ship and a US frigate almost. They're very, very capable ships. They're just painted a different color often. Those ships from the PRC are heavily present in the Western Pacific. Right? They are applying sovereignty, national interests across the Western Pacific. Their fishing fleet is presenting sovereignty and national interests globally. We have a force structure that is highlighted on this conventional mission, this conventional big war fight. We're going to have this challenge with China. Interestingly, it is unclear how much of that force structure the Navy is buying is going to be useful in that fight. I think it's just an analytical challenge to say how well those assets are going to do in a high-end fight with China. We have very little actual real-world data about how China would do. They haven't fought many battles recently or wars. So it's unclear, but there's a lot of analytic community that says you're buying high-end warfighting gear, but it's still not going to be useful. I think that's an open question. I'm going to highlight for what we call small surface combatants, a frigate, a corvette. They're the ones that take the dominant portion of the out and about mission, the presence mission, the escort mission. The one thing we've absolutely proved with our ability, with the Navy and the industrial base in the country is we can't build them. We can't design them. We can't build them well. For a variety of reasons, our industrial base, our process does not allow us to build the right ships there. We'll talk about that right now. We have a requirements process. It's very consensus-based. It doesn't always account for capability. It doesn't allow us to build the ships we need unless you have the political leadership inside the Navy for that group. It's a bunch of tribes. If you don't have enough surface warfare people, the surface Navy saying, I want the right frigate, it's not going to get built. If Congress and the Armed Service Committee doesn't want that ship, it's not going to get built. So you have this challenge. This is to totally bore you. So how the heck does the Navy do this? Why is it doing this? Like, this seems crazy. So interesting, Navy requirements are generated by the Navy. The Navy says, this is what we want. This is what we need. All right, so they can do that. It can be, and it's quite useful, and it articulates a good set of technical requirements. There's a bunch of other ones, and here's for example, the middle one, there's a bunch of general technical requirements. We're going to build a ship. It has to have certain survivability. It has to have certain war fighting. You have to have enough bunk space and head space and galley space. We call those general specifications. The Constellation class, the new frigate that we were going to buy that just got canceled, was killed by general specifications. We bought an Italian ship. We said, oh, we're not going to put a ship out there that can't survive a mine hit, because the last frigate, for example, got hit by a mine, Samuel Roberts. So we have to have these. So that meant we had to redesign the whole ship. What was the point of buying a ship that's already been designed? And so the Constellation class died. The other one is just ironic, and this goes into the timeline, right? It takes a long time to design a ship, it takes a long time to build a ship. They stay in service for a long time. The Ford class I was talking about, the key to the Ford class, the thing that made it special, was it could generate a lot of sorties every day. 160 sorties a day. That was the design criteria for the whole ship. That is a complete artifact at Desert Storm when we had an aircraft carrier parked 120 miles off of a rock, and we could generate sorties like crazy. In fact, we wanted more, hence the Ford class. If you're going to get into a scrap with China, you're not going to be 120 miles off Taiwan, because then you really will get sunk. You're going to be 1,000 miles off, and you're going to generate sorties at a much slower rate. So, but by the time you get down this far, it's not like you're going to change that requirement, because then I got to start over and I'll never build a ship. Same thing with the DDG 1000. It was designed with big guns to go support Marines going ashore. There's no point we're ever going to do that again, right? Because everybody can shoot missiles or drones or small boats at the things dropping the Marines off. That mission is dead. That whole ship was designed around that mission. So you have this weird requirement lag process. So we at RAND think of requirements definition as the original sin, right? So you don't think about, the Navy doesn't always do a good job thinking about total force structure when they're designing individual components of the force structure. What you really need to do is design, here's what I want my force structure, numbers and capabilities, and then allow that to flow down. That's a very difficult thing to do, and they haven't done a great job of it. Again, we have these transient conditions. We designed the Ford class around sortie rate, DDG 1000 around the ability to shoot big guns against people so Marines can go ashore. We had this thing called the Littoral Combat Ship. That was going to be our frigate, and it was designed to have essentially no crew. And then we were going to take modules, and it could do mine warfare one day, and you take that off and put something on. It could do anti-surface warfare. It didn't work. And so we had to cancel that. We have this challenge. The Navy and the Marine Corps have to buy amphibious ships for the Marine Corps, and the Navy hates to spend money on that, and the Marine Corps says they never get enough. So you have this, what do you need out of a amphibious ship? In the end of the day, amphibious ships turn out to be super, super useful. They're big, carry a lot of stuff, carry a lot of people. They stick around for a long time. They have medical facilities. So it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't matter. Just buy amphibs, and you're going to use a lot of them. Virginia is a case. The Virginia, we were building the Seawolf. It was this fantastic ship. The Soviets became Russians. It was a terrible day for the submarine force. I was a submariner at the time, so what was the point? They were $5 billion a copy. At the time, we couldn't build them anymore, so we went and built the Virginia, but we had to do it really fast. Our electric boat was going to go out of business. So we designed the Virginia to be a much more affordable platform. It is a fantastic submarine, but we really didn't have time to think about how you fix them. Turns out they are just terrible to fix, and they have gummed up all of our sustainment facilities. So this is the way, these are the challenges. And the bad news is, as I talked about, if you have a bad set of requirements, you own them forever. Right? You've bought the Ford class carrier is not going to be redesigned in the rest of my career, and possibly in some of your careers. So you own a bad decision for a long time. On the other hand, you own a good decision for a long time too. The Aegis class destroyer has been built since the 80s, and it's still top of the notch. So good and bad. The good news is the Navy actually controls you, so you'd think they could fix it. And we think, that's our job, is to help them. So that's the requirement side. Let's talk for a sec about sustainment, shipbuilding challenges. So we in the Navy are completely controlled by our ability to produce ships and submarines and fix ships and submarines. If you can't build them and you can't fix them, you have nothing to use. And this has been a slow problem that's been building for years. There is no commercial shipbuilding in the US. Anyone that ever tells you there is, they're wrong. We can build a yacht occasionally, but we have no significant commercial shipbuilding. Some ferries, actually. Shipbuilding in the US is almost exclusively for the US Navy and the US Coast Guard. All right, there's no competition in that world. As an aside, about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of our shipbuilding budget is on nuclear powered ships, carriers and submarines, and their sustainment. So it isn't like there's a commercial industry out there for those anyway. So it's collapsed. We only have 5 shipyards. One of the thoughts is we built LCS at 2 new shipyards, which means you now just have 2 more shipyards that are talking to their congressional delegations that need care and feeding. There's no competition. So if you're going to buy and build these ships, our acquisition system is designed for competition. There is none. So you have to manage private sector firms who report to the Wall Street with a bunch of Navy and DoD civilians and officers who have no idea what that world is like. There's a ton of niche issues in the defense industrial base. Okay, I was talking to Eric. Think about it. From 1990 through about 2015, the only thing we cared about when we bought things for the military is efficiency, the cost per effect. And we were very successful. We squeezed every bit of excess capacity out of the system. The downside is when you now need to grow that industry, there's no slack in the system, and you're rebuilding it from ground one. Where you had 10 suppliers for valves, you have 1 supplier. So it's really hard to grow. Shipyards just lack capacity, and we can talk about that in detail. One thing I can't even express is there is no competition. We're just divvying up. In fact, for the submarine world, after the end of the Cold War, we were going to shutter. The thought was, let's shutter Electric Boat. We just need 1 nuclear shipyard. There's not enough demand signal. So we'll put all the submarines and carrier work down in Newport News. We actually, not me, but other folks at RAND helped think that through. You're going to lose half your future capacity. So what they did is now they cut the submarine in half. You build essentially half the submarine in Newport News down in Virginia and half at Electric Boat. Then you ship them back and forth on the East Coast and you weld them together. That's what we do. And it kept both shipyards in business. But some of those pieces, it's 4 months where major parts of those submarines are in transit or getting ready for transit or testing them to make sure the transit was okay. And that's how we build them. Super inefficient. But it was necessary to maintain some industrial base. There's no commercial shipbuilders that offer alternatives. There is alliance potential, Korea, Japan, designers from Europe. Labor is a major and systematic problem, both in how we build ships and how we fix ships. They happen to be labor union driven at all the major shipyards, first in, last in, first out. So when we cut down the shipyards, everybody below a certain age left. About 2021, COVID hits, your shipyards are extremely senior and extremely efficient. We built submarines in an astonishingly good manner for a long time. COVID hits, everybody retired. And you can see it in the efficiency. Supervisors at Electric Boat have about 6 years of experience total. They have about a In the paint facilities, you see 30, 40% turnover per 6 months. How do you build a workforce there? The ideal workforce for a shipyard has you want people to be right around average age around 40 with about 19 years of experience. That is the perfect shipyard. We can't build it right now because we can't keep them and we don't have anyone in the system to train them. So we have really poor efficiency. The supply chains in all of our shipbuilding industry are challenged. If you want to build large castings for nuclear ships, which is 2/3 of our budget, there's one, maybe two entities in the country that can do it. And they are not that interested in expanding, right? Huge capital investments, low rate of return. It's a tough market. So unmanned systems are going to solve it for us. And they certainly can play a major role. We see that every day now. If the U.S. Navy decides, so one comment is, it's really hard to replace a whole Navy ship with an unmanned ship, right? We don't have 300 sailors on a ship to look out the windows, right? They have to operate it, they have to fix it, they have to do battle damage. So now if you have it's one thing to have an unmanned system go out for a day or two or hours, but if you're going to have a very sophisticated piece of equipment doing very sophisticated things, it's really hard to keep the engine going, to keep the systems running. So unmanned is very challenging as you go up. And now I'm going to put it in a corrosive environment with weather and bash it around with waves. Just a tough environment. So we have to think that through in the Navy about how we're going to do that. So I think for the Navy, they do not have yet a handle on the unmanned systems. You see them thinking about small or medium-sized USVs. I think it's probably going to go more towards the idea that you're going to have bigger ships that deploy smaller unmanned systems. I think the idea of having purely unmanned systems is very difficult. A big bill to be paid. We'll see how it goes. And this is just my last one, and this is just an eye chart, but I think when we think about industrial-based challenges, I think we have to live in the world of reality. And so this is a defense industrial base, and I know this is meant to be eye candy. So this is guided munitions. We did a study on this. I took all the names off it so I can show you. On the bottom are the primes, Lockheed, Raytheon, Boeing. Here's all the different programs, this missile or that missile or whatever. And here's all the subcontractors that we can identify. You can't identify below the first one, maybe 1.5 layers of subcontractors. Below that, nobody knows who's supplying these people. It's reality. So for this program, 23, which I have no idea what it is, the dark red lines are all of the suppliers for that missile. Okay? The dark red, the pinkish lines are all the programs that those suppliers also supply. So this one program interacts with every single, with the exception of two, essentially interacts with every other program. And this subcontractor is not keeping enough capacity to raise the production of all those levels, right? They have to live every year with the production they do have, and they don't want to keep any extra production because it just costs them money. So all these subcontractors are at a very efficient rate of production. So when you choose to increase one program, first of all, you're affecting all the programs. And we have no way easily to interact with those subcontractors to start stroking checks. One thing you could do is just say, I'm going to go write checks to all the subcontractors. It's really hard to do. And there's another level behind this. We have no idea what that is. This is guided munitions. It is the same for every defense system out there. You can say, well, we're going to go COTS or the civilian infrastructure. If you were to look at the overlap, there's no civilian infrastructure out there building fuses or warheads. This is the world we live in. And we have to just expand it. But it's hard. And so I think that shipbuilding is like this in a different manner, but I think all of the challenges you see out there for supply chains growing the military, not just protecting the supply chains for the civilian industry, economy. This is the world we live in, and this is why it's so hard. So, and it's a great eye chart. So that's my short and sweet.
Great, thank you. So the floor is open. Andrea, saw you first. Everyone else, keep your hands up.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Andrea Howard. I'm a first-year PhD student here. I'm also a fellow ring knocker, class of 15 in a dolphin wear. I had the unique experience of serving on the USS New Jersey during its 96-month delivery of a 48-month notional timeline, the longest to date for the Virginia-class submarine. And so I'm curious to hear how has RAND suggested to the Navy to help keep the shipyard accountable? So yes, they're at capacity, but oftentimes my experience was that the shipyard would point to crew readiness as a distractor when they weren't meeting their milestones for delivery.
And you mean in new
New construction.
construction?
Yeah. So what suggestions have you guys been able to provide for the Navy in regard to bolstering the accountability for shipyards?
So it's great question. A couple things off the top. One is, if you looked at the free cash flow, so we have been building Virginia-class submarines since the early 2000s, and we were very good at them. And then, as we want to do for acquisition programs, we transitioned to a fixed price contract, just the way we're supposed to, right? You, the shipyard, owe me a submarine for $2.3 billion or whatever the number was. And then we increased it to 2 submarines a year and got a discount. That's a good deal. And then we started to build the Columbia-class submarine, which is as big as 5. So that's like 2.5 submarines of size, of a Virginia size. So we went from building 1 Virginia a year to 5 Virginias a year, equivalent sizes. And I think what happened there is, and you can see it in the data, the shipyards, and then COVID hit and everybody retired. So, for example, the electric boat was wrapping submarines in $100 bills to deliver them to the Navy, because their cost of construction was well above the contract price. So contractually, they didn't have enough money to invest in technology, to invest in anything else. You just had a contractual situation in which they were trapped. So we've talked to them about that. I mean, by the way, the Navy's under no obligation to listen to RAND. The other one is you do build these submarines where no single shipyard can build a whole submarine. All of the curved parts of a submarine are built down in Newport News, and all the straight body ones, they do a lot of the work down at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and then they assemble it in Groton, an electric boat. But neither shipyard can build a whole submarine. So there's no competition, right? You can build half, I can build half. How do we run a competition between us? So we've said you've got to break away this sharing arrangement. You've got to make the time and effort to build real capacity for submarines, to build the entire submarine at both shipyards. The problem is there's an incredible demand for those submarines now, and you're about to impose a lot of variability by doing that. We're going to have to do it sooner or later. I think that they, and this is, the shipbuilding is well above RAND's ability to influence, but I think that they have to take a step back. They're going to have to figure out what is the path of availability. You cannot miss the delivery of the Columbia because it is our strategic deterrent. So if there's free resources, they're not going to go to the Virginia class, they're going to go to the Columbia. So I think it's going to take time, and they have to rebuild their workforce. But this idea that the ship's crew has anything to do with it is just ridiculous. So they're trying to contractually, they're in a bad way, the shipyards. Long story where I didn't answer.
I was at a loss for ideas as well.
Very. So I'm interested in surface combatants, especially the frigate destroyer.
Yeah.
Surface combatant. And so we've taken what, 3 swings at a small surface combatant, or 2 swings in the last 15 years. One was the little combat ship, and the other was this new frigate. If you had to assess what's the main underlying problem why we can't bring a useful small warship program to fruition, what do you think the main problem is? Because I think almost everyone agrees that we need one.
Yeah.
But after that, all the agreement goes away.
So I think this is where it gets into, I think the specifics matter. I think how you make decisions matters. In the case of the LCS, and I'm going to get the CNO wrong, I think, I'll forget his name now, but the CNO said, I want a $200 million a small frigate, big Corvette, small frigate. And he set the price tag, and he said it, and the CNO pushed this, and it didn't make any sense. Like the acquisition, like the Navy requirements, technical community completely failed in the LCS. I mean, that's a strong language. I just think that
we've toured them, and the first thing that occurs to you as you walk through one is those, kind of a nice ship, but where are the weapons on this thing? I mean, is this a fighting ship? I mean,
yeah, so I think that, I think you have to remember back in the day, they didn't have, but when they did that, you did not have this demand signal from China for the ability to, but yeah, it was the requirements from that ship never matched either the bill, and we made massive bets on technology that did not turn out. And then subsequently, we decided that this wasn't working, and we went to the Constellation class, in which and Rand has written on this extensively, that we told the Royal Australian Navy, hey, when you build a ship, they wanted to build ships in Australia. We said, you don't get into the design business on your own. Buy a design that's works, that's out there, that's proven, but don't change the design. And I think that's the challenge we got into there. If you're going to buy a proven design that you really like, you can't tear apart that design and reimpose specifications that cause you to redesign 90% of the ship. And that's where we got into the problem.
Both of the things you're saying are common sense. I'm asking, you've been studying it, you've been in this institution, you've been studying this institution, right? This rises to the level of a pathology.
Yeah.
And you can describe the mistakes.
Yeah.
The question is, what is it about the structure of decision making and the ideas about war that are in the heads of the commanders that are in the acquisition chain? What is it that's driven these 2 mistakes? And is there any reason at all to believe they're not going to make another one the next time they go to bat?
No. I mean, that's flip.
It's good.
I think that, so let me take a step back, ironically. I think the DG-1000, for example, cost a lot of money. It's a beautiful ship. That's one that we got the requirements wrong, but we built a really fabulous ship. And I think if you redesign parts of it for the requirements you need, it's a great basis for a ship. So I don't think it's that we can't build a ship. And I think in the case of the carrier, again, as we point out, sometimes requirements are a little off, but we designed a really great ship. So I think you can design the ship, but you have to get the requirements right, and you have to have the community inside the Navy that stands by those requirements and carries it through the process. And that is hard to do because you get too many cooks in the kitchen, and you've got to stick to your knitting on this. One of the benefits for the submarine community is you have a 4-star naval reactors, and he can help that community organize itself from its better natures, if you will, sometimes, right? So it instills good order and discipline in their decision-making process. I think we have an opportunity We missed it with the frigate. Every major Western and Asian ally of ours were buying frigates at the same time. It was a perfect time for a common frigate program, and we missed our opportunity. Everybody went their own way. Actually, the Brits ended up designing the ship that everybody's buying. The Australians, the Canadians, and the Brits all use the Type 26. All the navies now need to replenish their destroyers. We've been building an Aegis class for way too long. The Japanese, the Koreans, the Brits, the Australians need to replace theirs. So there's an opportunity now to do co-design, co-production, co-sustainment, in which you incorporate the Korean and Japanese ability to incorporate production into design now. And we need to do that. We do not have the ability to build ships the way the Koreans and the Japanese do. They are simply more efficient and higher quality at shipbuilding. So I think now's our chance to use our allies to do this. But I think it's going to take that.
Your finger on this?
Do you think there's actual hope in that? Because it's from the technical specs perspective, right? That's all there, fine and dandy. But once it gets up to congressional staffers and all that, and it's not made in America, even though the small industrial base doesn't want to expand, they also don't want to lose that business.
So I don't think it's fair to blame Congress on this one. On the, I don't think the Congress told them to redesign the Constellation class. That was on the Navy. I don't think the Congress said build the LCS the way you did. That was on the Navy. The Ford class, by the way, one of the reasons it really struggled was the Navy originally went, this is back in the day, when Don Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, and they were going to do a 3-ship transition because it was too much technology for the first ship. And Rumsfeld said, no, we're going to do revolution in military affairs. All of it goes on one or I won't approve it. So the Navy said, okay. And they've really struggled with some of that technology. They figured it out, but that's one of the reasons it was a tough first ship. But yes, I think there's, Hanwha bought the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. There's a lot of desire, I think, to incorporate the ability of the major Asian shipyards and their production capabilities into the U.S. Navy shipbuilding. Those countries, Japan and Korea, both want to put a lot of American gear on top of the hull. They're really good at the HM&E, the steel, the power plants, etc. But they really would like our technology for combat systems and munitions. So I think there's a deal to be made. And above my pay grade, but I think that's a deal that can be made.
You'll see.
Coming back to the eye chart, this problem is not unique to the Navy. This problem is unique to every manufacturing company out there.
Yeah.
Intel doesn't know who is the 4th tier, supplier out there. They would love to know, but nobody tells them because nobody wants to be moved around. Nobody wants to, and it's a competitive advantage for the tier 1 supplier to know who the tier 2 suppliers are and all this. But there are efforts to do it, and today with good large language models and other way of doing business, you can find out.
Yeah.
Especially now, you can do it. So my center can offer a service.
So,
of course, just I have to do a commercial here, but it can be done.
yeah, I totally agree, and I think they should do it. But that's the second problem they have. I think their first problem on this is, unlike Intel or Apple, or when I was in the semiconductor business, it was Nokia. That's how long ago it was. And
What?
yeah, exactly. The challenge here for us, for the military to improve their supply chain, is they have no ability to project an increased volume business in any way that anyone there will trust and therefore make an investment on their own. right? So their business planning doesn't, you can say till the cows come home, I'm going to buy more munitions, and nobody believes you. So they don't make any investments. And they won't make any investments until they get a hard check. And then it takes 18 months to buy the gear to do the expanded production. So I think one of our problems here is not so much that second, third tier suppliers. I think it is the demand signal communication has no validity, and it's going to take time. And I don't think this is an easy thing. In the Desert Storm, the U.S. Navy flew in. It had these things that they big missiles they attached to F-14s called the Phoenix missile. It was so cool. And they show up in Iraq, and the Air Force, and it was beyond horizon, shoots everything down. And the Air Force said, absolutely not. You are not shooting that missile anywhere near me. And it went obsolete that day. We took them out of the inventory. AMRAAM Bs or Cs, old AMRAAMs, we don't use them anymore. They're no good, right? So the military is stuck with this. If I go all in and I buy the capability I need against you today, and then you change the capability I need tomorrow, it's all sunk cost and I've wasted my money. It's not trivial. So I don't think it's easy, but you have to have better demand signal for the industry.
It happens in civilian industry. There are changes in technology, changes in competitors, changes all the time.
Mhm.
And so you have to adjust.
Yeah.
You adjust all the time. You adjust your product, you adjust your marketing, you adjust procurement, you adjust all the elements.
Yeah.
And the problem that I see is that the whole political structure about it, within the Navy and above the Navy, that kind of seem to slow things down.
It's certainly part of the challenge, but I do think that the ability to project an increased demand signal that people can trust would start to help fix the problem. And it can't be a little bit of increase. We sort of have an industry that has a certain amount of capacity there. And all we're really doing right now is maximizing that capacity. We really haven't made the investment. We have not caused the industry to go to the next level investment to get to that capacity. And we're going to have to go through that. And it's going to lead to the same thing we saw in shipbuilding, that the timelines will be slower than we expected, et cetera. But I completely agree with the tactical piece you're saying, but at the strategic level, we don't have the demand signal indicated.
Sam, thanks so much for this talk. I was curious if you all considered at all the possibility of having government-owned production facilities, so operating their own shipyards, especially since industry doesn't seem interested in expanding capacity.
Great question. So the Army has a big piece of its industrial base is under the control of the Army in their, like artillery shells, artillery tubes, all of that is within the Army, and I forget the name of it, out of Picatinny. And I did a study for Australia on like how much should they maintain domestically under their government control, like a government-owned, contractor-operated facility. Sometimes they're government-owned, government-operated. But yeah, so you can do that, and the benefit there is if you write a $100 million investment into that, you keep the $100 million investment. If I increase my production on one of these munitions for a while in the private sector, and then I lower my production, they'll sell off they'll sell off that production capability. So one of the benefits of going to government controlled is you can have a better sense of, do I actually have that ability to produce in the future? But it's almost always less efficient and it costs more. And now you have to pay for all of the, upkeep. So 6 one way, half dozen others. Same thing with shipbuilders. Should we think of shipbuilders, they can only sell to the Navy. The nuclear shipyard can't sell to anyone else. They only can sell to the U.S. Navy. Why isn't it a public utility? Right? Like, why don't we just regulate them like a public utility? I mean, I think there's lots of downsides to that as well, but those are all, I think those are all legitimate questions. All the shipyards that fix nuclear ships and submarines are publicly owned shipyards by the Navy.
Scott Johnson, visitor
Oh,
from.
sorry,
It's up.
I'm adding you to the list, Scott, but not calling on you. Yeah, sorry, that's our norm, but, so I've got, Eric Hickenbotham next.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. I feel for you having to represent the Navy up there. But I would love to ask you about aircraft carriers and what we're doing, spending, $20 billion on a carrier that has to sit beyond the range of an aircraft out there in an Asian theater. But instead, I'll be responsible and ask you about the industrial base, the main topic. So on AUKUS, in addition to buying first, I suppose, buying used submarines and then buying new submarines, Australia is investing in the industrial base, right? So how does that play out? I know there's been a little bit of controversy about, Australia sort of drawing on our submarine building capacity and therefore lowering our own rate of deliveries, et cetera. But with the contribution to the industrial base, sort of where do you reach that break-even point? And then following on from that, since everybody's going to need to keep up with the Joneses here. So when Japan decides that they need nuclear submarines from the United States, which could be coming down the pike, what is that going to look like? And at what point do you sort of break the capacity, if ever, right?
Small questions.
Yeah.
So I'll just be clear. I mean, we've been doing research for the Australian Navy for 15 years. So I think AUKUS is, from a strategic perspective, is an unadulterated win. It signals all kinds of things in the Pacific. So I think it was really good. I mean, I think it has lots of benefits. I think from the industrial base piece of it, it's 3 submarines. Maybe you're going to give them 3 old submarines. Maybe you build them 2 new submarines. I don't think, in the great scope of it, that if that's a big problem, like we have big problems. I think the idea of the Australians build, Australia's 25 million people, right? So that's not a big place. And they want to build everything on their own. And I keep telling them, like, you got to pick and choose. So they want to build them and fix them. I think I think they're going to build we are lily padding. We can't home base in Australia per their law. We're sending submarines to Western Australia for extended periods of time, at which they will have the facilities there to do some maintenance. We have an enormous deficit of capability to fix our submarines. Our public shipyards are just on their knees trying to fix them. I think it's added capacity into the system. And my comment I said it to the Australian CNO a long time ago. Hey, I think the deal to be made is don't get into the build business. The build business is unnecessary. The fix-it business is ongoing, right? So if you're going to buy, a $5 billion submarine, then make a deal. The U.S. Navy is going to send you $1.5 billion worth of work every year in fixing submarines or something like that. We need the capacity to fix it. They are putting in the capacity. I don't think it's going to be a big deal. I think there's lots of startup issues, but I don't think it's a big deal. I think the idea of building them in Australia is super difficult. I think the idea of I think there's going to be a lot of challenges to 3 countries, really 2 countries, designing a submarine to be built in the UK and Australia. The UK capacity is extremely limited, and they're working very hard at it. I just think that part of it, I have very limited visibility into it, but I think that's more difficult. I think they should get into the fix-it business.
Caitlin.
I wanted to ask you about the Slick 'em in. My name is Vipin Narang, by the way. Just kidding. I'm Caitlin Talmadge, but we have another faculty member very interested in this, but who hasn't asked about it.
It's blowing my fire.
Yeah.
You guys just make fun of me every time I ask about something.
You would just give a speech in favor of the missile. So my perception is that the progress on Slick 'em in has been slow, which is a little surprising to me, given that we deployed, nuclear sea launch cruise missiles during the Cold War. My perception maybe is that one of the reasons is the Navy, isn't a big fan of the missile, would prefer to have conventional munitions on those platforms. And I guess my question is my perception of that the Navy kind of slow rolling this and being opposed to it. Is that accurate as to explaining some of its trajectory? And I guess more substantively, is the Navy's kind of resistance to it, is it justified? I mean, should we not be making that trade-off and keeping a more of a conventional focus?
So I have no insight into whether the Navy's slow rolling or not.
Secretary Del Toro was slow. It's just helped.
I tried to save you from this, but
So I think that so a couple comments. I think that there is, we would think about this, and the work we've done here, I know reflects this. We think of it on a couple levels. One, there's just sort of the nuts and bolts level. Where are you going to load them? Where do you put the stuff in and out? It's an infrastructure we haven't used in a long time, so we have to go make sure we have the infrastructure on how to do it. So just the care and feeding of a nuclear weapon requires a certain amount of work. So we would look at that. I think the other question that's a legitimate one is a Tomahawk-based nuclear tactical weapon the right answer? I think that's an open question.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I think it's a legitimate question to ask, is a Tomahawk-based tactical nuclear weapon the right answer? You know, so I think you have to, in that case, you'd have to think about, people can shoot down cruise missiles fairly readily, particularly the people that you might want to signal one of those with. So
We got a hypersonic.
So then it becomes, right, so then there's two levels of question to that. There is, what is the utility of a tactical nuclear weapon based in the Navy? I think this is an enduring question. It was the first one I worked on when I was in the Pentagon. And I didn't work on it. I was just an ensign carrying the guy who worked on its briefcase before I got to my submarine. But that was in the day, there was this idea, if the Soviets could nuke a carrier battle group, we would like to have something between that response. Our only response was to go big time. So we needed something at sea that could respond. It was on the deterrence ladder or the escalation ladder. I think all those questions are still valid. But I think it is worth spending some time to think about, is that the right weapon and how would you employ it? And I think you have to keep in mind that you have a precious asset, the submarine. There's very few of them. There's fewer than we'd like, and we can't get them out of the sustainment yards. And you're displacing another weapon with that weapon. So you have to think that through.
Anything else you want to say before the?
No, I'm ready.
Okay. Vipin, your finger.
Vipin Ring, it was, this is a, well, she teed me up. This is something I worked on in the Biden administration on nuclear policy, and we started canceling SLCM in the NPR. But the Congress and the NDAA, as you know, put it back, and the administration itself sort of ended up in sort of no man's land on it because as the security environment deteriorated, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and the maritime environment, as you said, the options are really limited. Right, you either have to go big, or you've got a 76 TAC-2 on Ohio, which is a strategic platform, or you've got to penetrate with bombers because we don't have DCAs in the Indo-Pacific. And so it's sort of the, whether it should be a hypersonic or a TLAM-based SLCM, I think is sort of not the, I think that's a reasonable question, but the NDA is pretty explicit about it. So, but I guess the question is sort of the trade-off on conventional versus, there's this argument in the Navy, with all due respect to Big N Navy, the Big N Navy says, oh, you're going to cannibalize our conventional capability. But if the answer is tens of these and not hundreds of them, and if the answer and the scenario in which they're most likely to be useful is when you burn through all your conventional Tomahawks, if you've got 1,000 TLAMs and they haven't really done the trick, you burn through 990. It would be nice if your last 10 had a nuke on. Right, so the sort of trade-off argument.
That's a matter of taste.
If you care, send the best. If there's a, so the trade-off argument is sort of disingenuous. I think the organizational argument about you gotta certify the crews, you need the SWIFTs, you need like to rebuild this infrastructure is a reasonable one. But at some point, Big Ant Navy is very good at the political game. At what point does like Congress and the executive saying you're going to do this, get the Navy on board? Because it's still, even despite the NDAA.
So,
right?
great point. And I would say a couple things. One is the signaling of it, the deterrence of it.
The terms and assurance value is very way.
I don't think anyone has an argument about that. If it's embedded in it's going to change the outcome of a war, then I have some questions. So I think you got to get through those. I think the issue I have with isn't that you are displacing the odd tomahawk, right? It maybe not a lot of, but if you're going against a defended place against a tier 1 opponent like China, it's not 1. It's not 2. How many do you need to get through? So I think that's but it's an answerable question that we can't answer here, but it would be an answerable question. But depending on the conflict, it isn't that I'm not using the tomahawks for something else. I'm using the whole platform for something else.
Depends on your comms.
Well, it depends what I'm doing, but if I'm trying to stop an invasion, I have to get a lot of torpedoes in the water fast. And what I don't want to have is potentially, I don't want to have fast attack submarines providing some sort of tactical deterrent at that level because I need them sinking ships. So I think there's an issue there. But to the question of signaling, I think it's clear. If we had a larger this goes back to if I had a larger submarine force, maybe some of that choices change. But that's just Paul's opinion. It in no way represents either Rand or the Navy's opinion.
For starting that.
Excellent. Well, we can return to the Slicka Man if there's time at the end. John Cafferly.
Thanks. I learned quite a bit. So when the Navy calls Rand up and says, "Hey, what kind of Navy does the nation need for maritime dominance?" What does Rand do now? Like, what is the value that Rand provides? How do you do it? What are the methods? What's the empirics? Like, how do you know this stuff that the Navy can't know?
Well, so not well. I don't know well. I think a couple things. One is we answer. So the Navy has its own in-house studies and analysis shop called the Center for Naval Analysis. So they're going there first, right? So why come to Rand to answer Navy questions? I think there's 2 reasons they would potentially come to Rand. One is the nature of our work. We're just inherently joint. We get a lot of work from the Air Force. We get a lot of work from the Army. We get a lot of work from the Office of the Secretary of War. So our research staff, which can work on all of that, is inherently more joint in the way we do analysis. I think CNA is every bit as objective as Rand, but Rand doesn't have Navy in its name. And if we have to, we'll take the NMF part off of the contract. So I just think we're perceived, at least, if not actually, we're perceived as being more independent. So that is why you might come to Rand, is you would like to have an outside perspective that can withstand sort of an independence, objectivity scrutiny. How we do it, we have, I would say, what I perceive as an interesting mix. We have about half of my team is what I would call professional analyst people who come out of academia and they spent their whole career, and we grow them up and they turn into cool analysts. I think we have about a quarter of our staff is retired Navy who have a lot of experience in operational experience. And we also try to incorporate some retired senior civil servants. Like, you have to understand how the Navy works for us to get. If we give you the great answer and it's completely untenable, what's the point? So we do, I think, have a pretty cool mixture of sort of raw analytic talent that can, I think we do the best operational level modeling that there is. maybe not campaign level, but I think we do the best operational level modeling of outcomes available, and we pair it with people that know how to employ those models. So,
Thanks. Charlie?
Yeah, thank you. One comment and one question. So you argued that there was a mismatch between that the Navy's force structure was out of balance because it planned for the big war, but is most often used for all these other reasons. But that doesn't seem right if you think the big war is way more important than all those other reasons. So you'd have to put value on each of the actions. I mean, do you actually think it is out of balance or not, given the relative importance of the missions? But that's a comment. My question is.
That sounds like a question, but you can ask another one.
So you said you put a lot of emphasis on the importance of getting requirements right, but then you say, like in the case of carriers, we don't even know how well they'll do against China, and so given the picture you painted, which is this very long lifetime on when you buy something, and massive uncertainty about the effectiveness of the platform, how do you analyze that?
great. That is the heart of the challenge. Yes. I mean, I would like to say I articulated this challenge first, but I mean, it's just inherent in the problem, right? So I think therefore you always defer when they're getting their requirements right. You tend to defer to what is the high-end war fighting, and these things are going to be there for the next 50 years. What does it look like 50 years from now? It's extremely hard. So we try to portray as wide a variety of the futures as we can to look at alternatives that can satisfy the greatest amount of that. And I also think you have to maintain some humbleness. I think one of the challenges that LCS and DDG 1000 had is they weren't humble designs. We have an answer for a problem, and by the time I got in ignoring all the technology risk we took on those, we were not humble enough that we got the challenge or the solution wrong. So you have to build something that has flexibility in design, that it can last against a broad set of operational requirements and technologies of the future. But it's a hard problem. So I don't think that it's always. I mean, it's fun to make fun of the requirements is the original sin, but it's a hard problem. I mean, I don't think we always get it right, but sometimes we do. I think the submarine community has shown an ability to hit the mark well consistently, as an example.
Eric, is this a two finger on this?
Yeah.
And Kelly, is this a two finger?
Yes.
Okay. All right, two fingers.
So just to follow up, and maybe the answer to this is neither, or you're on the wrong track, but are there any design principles that would apply to this problem? So for example, when I was at RAND, I can't remember who, it may have been you, talked about designing ships with excess capacity for changes to the mission set. There may also be a philosophy where, especially as we go to unmanned systems, you could get almost the opposite, which is single function platforms, which are either manned or unmanned or what have you. So might one of those two be a partial answer to this? Cheaper single function things that you could produce maybe faster, or designing in excess capacity for change to the requirement later?
Yeah. So I think we need to do a better job of allowing margin into our designs, not just a little more electrical power, a little bit more energy, or what. I think they need to have a little bit more margin on space, a little bit more margin on, how much space, how much electricity, understand I'm going to have these for a long time, and what I'm using for 30 years from now is going to be different from what I'm designing for today. So I do think we just need to do that. This goes directly in resistance to the fact that it's a fixed budget and there's a lot of people eating at the budget, and the three tribes are beating each other up like crazy. Right now we have to replace the F-18 with some sort of sixth generation. We need to build a new surface combatant, and the submariners have been building the same submarine since the early 2000. So there's not an infinite amount of money. So invariably, when you go up to the head chef and say, I built a little margin in this, so it's going to look really good. Well, the first thing we're going to do is take that margin out because I got to give that to somebody else. It is a hard problem to think about how you put it all together. And sometimes they get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong.
Really?
I think my question is close enough to a variation on Eric's that we'll leave it there because I think the answer would rhyme.
Okay.
So I'll take it.
Scott Johnson, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, thank you. Visitor from HKS. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks for this talk. So if the big war begins, imagining a constrained trade environment, especially across the Pacific, what does this supplier base look like, especially into the second, third, and fourth year?
Yeah, it's great. So, and the supply guy left. Good. I think there are a couple comments. One is we ran a war game. Like we were just thinking about this at the beginning. I got into supply chains thinking about it because China sits on them, and I had done a bunch of work in Taiwan, and I was just amazed at the size of the semiconductor industry there. And so we played out the not even an invasion of Taiwan, but a coercive campaign where China coerces Taiwan, and we looked at the outcomes, whether reconciliation peacefully or it moves to something more vigorous, et cetera, et cetera. And the first thing you run into is if you lose that semiconductor capacity in Taiwan, there's just a world of hurt everywhere. It's not really a recession problem, it's a depression problem. So, if you look at, we lost one semiconductor fab in Japan due to the earthquake, and it almost shut Ford down. You take 40% of the semiconductor raw capacity, not even like not just the fact that it's the high-end stuff, like the AI folks are dead. But if you take 40, 50% of the raw semiconductor capacity out of the world, it is a breathtaking problem. And what makes it particularly interesting for geeks like me is everybody knows it's a problem and you might not be able to stop the war, right? Taiwan declares independence tomorrow. China's going to war the next day or something close to that. So it's a big problem. So I think that the supply chains, you have that high-end one, that you have these very bespoke supply chains that you could just destroy, and you're going to have a lot of problems with it. And then you have sort of the more commodity, mundane things that the U.S. Navy might have to escort ships through the Straits of Hormuz because the price of oil is going to go up like crazy. I don't know any way around that. So I think that, I think that the Navy and the military got into efficiency over effectiveness. The world got into efficiency over effectiveness, and now we're moving back to effectiveness from efficiency because we said we're really uninterested in the fact that our supply chains are at someone else's mercy all the time. And it's just going to take time to unwrap that.
Yeah, at least for the time being. The other country across from Taiwan also buys a lot from Taiwan.
Yeah,
right.
So you can hope.
So I wanted to ask, I guess I wanted to bring it to China. I think there was testimony earlier this week from Odie and I at a congressional commission talking about China entering into serial production of a new SSN and a new SSGN, Chinese shipbuilding. I don't know how many big hulls they put out a year. I'm sure you know the numbers, but I guess we call this in political science uneven rates of growth. And so I don't know the quality of everything that China's making. There's questions about crew capabilities, the weapon systems that go on, but from a sheer production level, right? It's a pretty extreme sort of chart where there'll be a point at which these two lines will cross. The Wall Street Journal had something I think about a year ago, just mapping out VLS cells, where the U.S. used to have a huge advantage, and now because of I think retirements and slower replacements, that gap is growing, and China may have as many VLS cells as we do, but all of theirs would be in Asia, and I don't know what share of ours. So, I mean, in light of all of this, and in light of kind of persistent calls for a larger Navy, and with, as you noted at the beginning, China is the pacing threat. How are we going to get a naval force that appears to because, I mean, you have outlined a lot of problems in
Yeah.
the process, and I guess I don't really, it sort of seems like, well, this is just where we are. Not a lot is going to change this, and we will just
Muddle through.
we'll muddle through, but we'll end up having a smaller, older, still excellent Navy, but it might not be fit for purpose.
So I think this,
at that level.
So I perceive China as not a near peer. I mean, I think the Chinese Navy is a peer. Maybe their submarine technology is a little bit behind ours. Just speaking from the open literature. So the Chinese Navy is absolutely a peer of ours. Its ability to do our tasks is quite high. And they are the world's workshop. They chunk out ships like crazy. Interesting, we did some research that looked at that said every time the commercial shipbuilding business gets a little shallow, they just build more Navy ships in between to keep a nice steady production. And the other question is, on the hopeful side, is they're going to have to fix all these ships someday, right? Like, so do they bother to fix them? But it's a huge problem. We have got to fix our shipbuilding to match that growth. Our submarine, we have been trying to expand our submarine production since 2012. If you remember, it was like 2 for 4 in 12. That was the thing. You can buy 2 submarines for $4 billion in 2012. Then we would sign that contract. And we haven't got there yet. We've been signing contracts for 2 submarines since 2012. We haven't got there yet. Now, part of it's because we're building the big Columbia at the same time. The submarine manufacturing, Columbia's going quite well. I mean, there's a lot of news about it. It's a little bit behind, but it's a huge ship. It's relatively, well, right. So it's relatively in good shape. And I think our submarine production, we're starting to see some green shoots that we've started to turn the corner. But there's no quick fix here. It just takes time and effort and money, and it's going to be very inefficient. We would suggest, at least looking at, should you break away this craziness that I ship them all over the East Coast, but it's going to take money and it's going to take a bigger budget, and you can't fix these problems without more money. It just isn't going to happen. There's no easy fix. And China has a huge Navy coming. Huge.
We have time for another question. Now I say 4 hands have come up, and everybody except Eric has already asked a question. So first Eric's hand, and then we'll cycle through the rest.
Hi, Eric Sand from the Naval War College, but my question's my own. I worry about the People's Liberation Army Navy, but what I really worry about is the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force. And I would like your take on I think we often think about naval warfare as being fights between navies, but I'm not sure that's what the fight looks like in the future. And so I'd be interested in your take, as you have looked at the Navy's problems, about how much we're still stuck in this, it's Navy versus joint force versus joint force for sea control.
Yep. So just as an example, yesterday we sank our first ship with a submarine since World War II. So I think it's no surprise to the Navy to tell them that they live in a world that's not Navy versus Navy. Actually, in my opinion, since the end of the Cold War, they haven't had another Navy to worry about. And now they do have another Navy to worry about. I do think that it is joint force versus joint force. I think, interestingly, in my mind, the joint force versus joint force tilted towards I could build more Air Force to cover for what the Navy couldn't do. And now what we're finding is the Air Force is getting pushed out just as far as the Navy. The only 2 assets that have any strategic mobility in the Western Pacific are submarines and stealth bombers. That's it. So I think that the only way you're going to fight this conflict with any potential success is from a purely joint nature, building on the assets you have that can provide useful capabilities.
And
Yeah, so I talked about the woes of my first tour, or sorry.
I feel your pain.
Yeah, the woes of my second tour were mostly shipbuilding related, and the woes of my first tour were about filling the missile gap, kind of to Taylor's point. So I was on the USS Ohio trying to rebuild a diesel in Pearl Harbor during COVID, while the other SSGN at the West Coast was holed up in Bremerton, Washington, doing a major availability. So how do you conceive of filling the missile gap, given that I believe that there will be a pretty significant gap between the retirement of the SSGNs and the delivery of the Block 5 Virginias? So Taylor touched on this a little bit, and I don't know if you would go unmanned for your answer, if maybe I'm not giving Brian and his surface friends enough credit with their TLAMs, but how do you conceive of that?
That's great. So SSGNs were sort of a mistake of history, right? We had 4 extra ships, 4 extra submarines. We could do something cool with them. We did something cool with them. And then we said, holy cow, that's really useful. So they are building a version of the Virginia that has more of them. I think actually my comment, so yes, this is a problem. Again, I think you got to look at this from the joint perspective. I think you have to say, how many things do I need to reach out and touch in a violent way, and where are they, and what are the different ways I can get an effect there? Because I think increased submarine numbers, increased surface ship numbers, it only took 1 torpedo to sink the Iranians' best asset. You know, we get stuff launched at our surface ships all the time off Yemen, in the Straits, all over, and it doesn't touch us because the world's getting very good at shooting down things in the air. So the demand signal for torpedoes, in my opinion, it's kind of old school. It takes a little bit longer to get it all done, but the value of torpedoes is going to go up, not down, because I have to operate in a world in which anything flying is in danger. So I think you have this balance that we have to figure out. How many missiles do I want to put on a submarine, which is absolutely the most expensive way to shoot a relatively small warhead at something, versus the value of the torpedo on a submarine that can bring down really big ships? I think that's a really open question. And I'm of the opinion that we should value torpedoes more now than we used to because of the capabilities of our opposition.
How do you suggest acquiring more torpedoes?
I think you're going to have to build submarines that can carry more torpedoes. I think you're going to need I think that our industrial base is limited in the number of submarines it can build per year, so you need to build submarines that carry more torpedoes. And nobody in the Navy has agreed to that, by the way. That's just Paul's point.
Well, Paul, thank you very much.
Well, thank you
for sharing all of your points with us.